Welcome to today's webinar, which is on geopolitics, supply chain, procurement, insights for risk mitigation in 2025. If you see me playing my hands, that's because lights in the room have been turned off and I'm just trying to turn them back on. So just ignore that part. So first of all, let me just introduce myself and today's panelists. So my name is Ashray Lavsi and I'm a principal at Efficio. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Efficio, we are the world's largest independent procurement and supply chain consultancy. We partner with our clients across the globe to help them in their transformations that establish themselves as a value leading functions within their businesses. I'd now like to introduce you to our panelists. We've got a fantastic panel consisting of three directors from Efficio. Each will represent a different region. They're based in three different regions within Efficio as well. First off, Andrew Black, who will be providing the European perspective. We've got Matt Lekstutis, who will be providing the US perspective, and Isabel Fernandes, who will be providing the MENA perspective. So let's just get into the first topic. So we know that with the recent geopolitical events such as ongoing US-China tensions, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the trade policy changes, all of those are reshaping supply chain strategies as we speak. First opening question to my panelists, how do you see these developments impacting businesses globally? Maybe Andrew, let's start with you.
Ashray, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for dialing in. I think what's interesting about geopolitical risks, as opposed to the more traditional risks that supply chain folk deal with, is that they are to a large extent foreseeable. So, for instance, US tariffs have been signaled by President-elect Trump for quite some time now. China has signaled an intention to resolve what it calls the Taiwan problem, and so on and so on when you think about these other big geopolitical events. So that's the good news, is that to some extent these things are foreseeable. The issue is, and the challenge is, that they are profound in their impacts and the effects are long-lasting. Again, thinking about something like US tariffs, if the Trump administration goes down that route, as looks likely, that is going to have a profound effect on global supply chain and global trade patterns. So how are these things impacting businesses globally? I think the first thing and the biggest thing is that it's driving much greater awareness of the sources of raw materials and components and the potential for volatility and disruption in supply, leading ultimately to attempts to diversify supply and build resilience into the supply chain. This in turn is driving a much bigger focus on supply chain compliance and risk management, and accelerating what we see in Efficio as an existing trend away from just-in-time supply chain management to just-in-case supply chain management. In other words, designing supply chains that are able to rapidly switch between sources of supply depending on what's going on in the world. This kind of volatility is also, I think, driving some of the big increases we've seen over the last couple of years in inflation and the corresponding increase in interest rates. And it's doing something that folks like me, who are in our mid to late 40s, have not had to do for a long time, which is to think about how to manage a world in which prices are going up rapidly and in which interest rates are high. These are the lessons that our parents had to manage back in the 80s and 90s, and which to a large extent we'd forgotten about, certainly over the last 20 years or so. To end perhaps on a slightly more positive note, I think the other thing that's going on is that these big geopolitical issues are driving a much greater focus on supply chain and pushing it up the agenda of things that the C-suite needs to think about. And it's also, I'll note in passing, driving much greater engagement from the public at large about supply chain, which means when I go to dinner parties now, people are much more interested in what I do for a living compared to perhaps 10 years ago, where supply chain was not so interesting to the man in the street. Ashray, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Matt, do you want to come in and give your perspective?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Ashray. I think what Andrew laid out really struck me, right, was we've been talking about risk management and supply chain since I started doing it many years ago, but now it's real, right? It's real in the sense of how we are designing our supply chains, operating our supply chains, and really the day-to-day decisions that we're making all the time. So really just over the last 5 to 10 years, right, have we started to see, sort of scenario-based planning, real-time networking and network design and network reoptimization, sort of come into vogue. So things are different, right? And we're operating our supply chains differently. And frankly, those supply chains themselves are quite different, right? If you look at what's happened in the U.S. over the last 5 years, reindustrialization is well underway. We've seen over $1.6 trillion come into manufacturing investment in the U.S. That's 4 times what it was, just 5 years ago. So, companies like Intel and investing in semiconductor industry, but we also see it in other sectors as well that are not just driven by strategic sector incentives, right? That they might be capitalizing on. So as we think about supply chain, right? It's become more about risk, right? And the potential futures and scenarios that we see, whether they're economic or structural or barriers that might be out there. And it's elevated to a boardroom level conversation, right? We have so many clients that are talking to us today about, well, so what's going to happen, right? Well, can't really tell you exactly what's going to happen, right? But we know a lot of things are going to happen, right? And we can help you think through what does that mean in your multi-tier supply chain, and how do you best position yourself so that you have the best, most likely outcome out of all those things. And I think also, supply chain is sort of back to being considered a competitive advantage and a competitive weapon in these kinds of scenarios, because it's not all downside, right? There's going to be opportunities here to capture new markets, to get a hold of assets and manufacturing capabilities that are extraordinarily valuable, right, in these kinds of risk scenarios.
Super. Thanks, Matt. Maybe with Isabel, let's just with you directly dive into more of a regional focus with this as well. So from a MENA perspective, what unique challenges or opportunities do you see in the current geopolitical landscape?
Hi, everybody. So, looking at MENA, obviously, MENA as a region, and obviously more particularly in Saudi Arabia, has had a very strong focus in the past few years, right? Because obviously with the big push from the new, obviously, since the new king took office in 2015, there has been a big push to diversify the economy from the dependency of the oil revenues, right? That's one has opportunities, because obviously, you are designing an economy almost from a blank piece of paper, in which you define what are your strategic sectors that you want to develop. And that aligns as well with the policies and the incentives that you do as a kingdom, as a country. But also as well, that have obviously given as well into a flurry or a frenzy of big infrastructure programs as well. The so-called giga projects like the NEOMs or Diriyah Gate or Alula, for naming a few of those. That obviously that has started putting pressure in the global markets because of the sheer amount, right? In terms of the amount of the steel they're consuming, the cement they're consuming, window panels as well. So in terms of supply chain resilience, obviously this is something that has been a conversation with our clients, just because it's the access to how do you compete for raw materials that are scarce to begin with, because just of the high level of demand that you have, but also in a sense that you are competing within the kingdom between all the giga projects. They are all looking at the same supply base, and it's something that has been already part of our work, is into how do you find new suppliers, how do you mitigate those shortages in terms of doing long lead time and long-term contracts as well. Obviously, with this additional pressure, and obviously as well as the latest China communications as well, in terms of eliminating or reducing some of the tax rebates to the exports, especially aluminium and copper. Obviously, Saudi is a producer of aluminium, but they don't have conversion capabilities, so they do import aluminium from abroad. That what it's doing is squeezing the supply. Obviously, it's pushing commodity prices up, but also as well is impacting, as I said, the construction industry, automotive industry as well. They are key sectors that they have defined as well by the national strategies as well. So obviously that coupled with obviously the high interest rates that due to all the GCC countries, obviously the currency is pegged to the US dollar, increases the cost for all the companies, working in the region, obviously pressure as well from workforce, talent, fighting for talent as well. There's already, you're looking at inflationary position, even though actual inflation rates are quite low, are single digits, very, very low single digits, that we are moving into the 1 to 2% at the moment. There have been some interest rates that have been cut recently, but obviously that is going to take some time to obviously pass through the industrial sector as well. Obviously, that gives you an opportunity because one of the other key pillars of the Vision 2030 that it was launched in 2016 is actually localize spend, localize supply chains, and obviously that is the big push as well. Everybody's talking about localization. And what it does is also encourages companies to look for investment opportunities in the kingdom. To minimize obviously the supply chain disruption, but also as well in terms of apply, because this is coming as well with regulation attached to that in terms of the conditions if you want to participate in the local economy as well. So the good news is that some investment, there are agencies that promote investments in the kingdom, and obviously that for companies, being companies that they are already in the kingdom or companies that they are suppliers to companies in the kingdom, is a good opportunity to expand the market share, to get some more business from companies that potentially will not be able to do business in the very near future, and also as well in terms of supply chain diversification. We are talking about doing supply chain ecosystems. Some of the biggest companies as well, like, Saudi Airlines, Saudi Techniques, they are expanding the MRO village in Jeddah. So they are going to be able to service their fleet of airplanes as well as they are. So I think there is the challenge that everybody is seeing in terms of, constraint of supply, obviously increased prices, but also the opportunities to be investing and to be creating partnership and to have an access to the bigger market share at the moment, and obviously the booming economy here in the kingdom.
Thanks, Isabel. So let's move to the US, Matt. And with every I'm sure that's top of mind for a lot of people here is the outcomes of the US elections, and how that might influence the tariffs and the trade policies. Could you briefly maybe share your perspective on what that means for supply chains, especially in the US?
Sure. Well, I think first off, it will, right? Let's start there, right? There will be changes and there will be adjustments, and we're already seeing the impact of that, and we're seeing things being signaled around tariffs, around trade policy, other economic objectives, things related to labor, right? So, if you take all of these things together, right, they create, uncertainty around cost positions, across the globe and your sources of supply. They create potential pressures on, labor costs and labor availability, as it relates to labor and immigration policy. And possible shifts in incentives, right, could change how we're seeing investment occurring in the U.S. Around manufacturing investment. So possibly de-emphasis of things like sustainable or renewable energy, or focus in other areas, right, could substantially change some things that are already underway. I think the other thing that we're seeing is the possibility that these things will be focused on not just the traditional targets, right? That the old targets that have fallen into the crosshairs, like China, right, are being joined by perhaps unexpected targets like Canada and Mexico, right? So, what do these things mean, right? So some of the big structural changes, right, that folks have been working on, say, GM's work, across the border with Canada, could be disrupted, right? There's lots of cross-border transaction in automotive. So I think the automotive sector is one of those areas that's looking at this very, very, very carefully, right? Both from the perspective of cost performance, as well as potential disruptions to border crossing processes, administrative adjustments, and just flow of materials and products, right? As new trade flows emerge, and I think Andrew alluded to this in his comments, right? That these are things that are done in large measure. Maybe you can see them coming, but when they happen, they happen, sort of fairly dramatic, right? So, I think there's a lot of discussion, within the U.S. right now around understanding what those various scenarios could look like, and what can I do, right? What can I do, today to start to position myself, for those things. First is to simply understand what that position is, right? And those areas that are sort of likely to be targeted either for investment or tariffs and other areas. But I think in general, right, I think it's we've got a supply chain that's looking forward to a very much more interesting few years ahead, right? With more changes, more unexpected, perhaps, policy adjustments and impacts, right, that are going to make our work in supply chain quite a bit more interesting, right? At the same time, I think U.S. companies have been preparing for this, right? They've done a lot, right, over the last 5 years. I talked about the 1.6 trillion invested in manufacturing capability in the U.S., right? That's matched with substantial growth and nearshoring in Mexico and in Canada. And at the emphasis of China, right? China investment has been flat over that 5 years. Well, Southeast Asia has quadrupled, right? So companies have implemented this China plus one strategy. They've got a more diversified base to work from, and they've got a business that's in tune to thinking about this, right? And in terms of both their operational processes and their strategic processes, and that's really where I think we as supply chain professionals can help, right? Is by bringing those things together, right? Driving that strategic conversation around what does it take to be competitive and resilient, but also what does it take to operate with resilience and build that into the DNA, if you will, of the processes as well as the network that we create.
That's really interesting because US is almost moving down the route that maybe Isabel you can address as well, with in terms of localization and how that's being prevalent in Saudi. That's almost going to be applicable now to the US on a much wider scale as well, right? With increasing drive. And then maybe once Isabel you answer that question, we come back to you, Andrew, to kind of understand if you're seeing something similar within Europe as well in terms of the policy trends.
Yes, Andrea. As I said, there has been the push in terms of localizing big sectors of the economy. Obviously, in terms of changing the trend of having the revenues from the oil, and then obviously there have been a lot of work in terms of how much money the economy was keeping or keeping at the beginning once when the booming of the oil era. So the key things I think that they are very comparable to what Matthew was saying was about that consciousness of this is what as a country we want to do with achieve. I mean, and as I say, the publication of the Vision 2030 set the very clear strategy and the path to arrive there, and that then have been coupled with all the later policies and obviously setting up the infrastructure and also the agencies and department that they are monitoring those policies, the compliance to those policies, but also at the same time, there has been a big push of, Saudi Arabia going to the market saying we are open for business. And essentially, and we want your business. The only thing that we want is we want you to bring your business in the kingdom that diversifies the economy, but also increase, obviously, transfer the know-how, transfer the IP to the local population, trains the workforce, and obviously everybody benefits, because one is obviously you increase your supply chain resilience, but also as well, in the medium long term, you decrease also your cost as well. Obviously, as you know, Saudi Arabia, doing some of the trading partners, it's a long journey to come. And also as well, they have been working in relaxing their red tape. They are working to reduce bureaucracy in terms of, there are agencies that they help foreign companies to set up the regional head offices here. They help them navigate all the legal paperwork of setting companies, but also in terms of hiring people, training people. There are also agencies that provide financing as well, also including obviously with the local small and medium enterprises as well. Obviously, the local content royal decree that was published in the late 2016, 17. As well, what it does is define the requirements for local content achievement in each one of the companies, and obviously PIF is one, obviously the bigger investors in the kingdom as well, and owns more than 90 companies as well. They have clear targets for their own portfolio companies to achieve this 60% target by 2025. So obviously that is encouraging that all the companies as well is to participate, as I say, to participate in that localization, and also understand how they can benefit from that as well. As I was saying before, right, is to say we can compete because we can be more competitive. Obviously, we are not going to have to pay so many tariffs because we are not going to be importing. Also, we are going to have access to some of the public government contracts as well, because we are going to be based into the region as well. And also, we are going to be benefiting as well in terms of having local workforce that is going to be at the beginning, obviously, through a strategic partnership to train and obviously upskill, but then at the end of the day, it's increasing the pool of available local resources.
Thanks, Isabel. Maybe Andrew, just 30 seconds from your side before we move on to the next topic on how do you see this trend resonates in Europe as well, in terms of the what Matt was talking about?
Thanks, Ashray. So I think Europe, in a sense, is in the unenviable position that it's impacted by pretty much all of the major geopolitical events that we've been talking about. But I think the big one clearly is the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the immediate impacts of that have been worked through. The energy price spike has been worked through, but I think it's the ongoing uncertainty about the outcome of that whole event and the collateral effects associated with it. And these collateral effects include things like the potential for significant cyber attacks or other activities designed to destabilize the region. And that includes attacking undersea internet cables, just to quote a news story that was in the media a couple of weeks ago. But it also includes things like the arming of so-called Houthi rebels in the Arabian Peninsula to attack Red Sea shipping. And I'll just quote a couple of statistics which I think illustrate this point. As of October this year, the number of daily transits of the Suez Canal stood at 29, compared with 80 last October. Most shipping has been rerouted, adding around 15 days to transit times, and with the effect of pushing up freight rates by as much as 3 times over the past year. And as a fundamentally outward-oriented trade bloc, this is profoundly destabilizing to the EU and its established supply chains. And I think what we expect to see then is more onshoring, so echoing some of the points that Matt was making earlier, more nearshoring. The big story in the news over the last couple of weeks has been the Northvolt gigafactory in northern Sweden, as Europe had attempted to become independent in the manufacture of EV batteries, and we know what happened to that endeavor. But Europe does trade heavily with China as well, and I think to some extent will try to thread the eye of the needle a little bit. continue to trade with China where it can, whilst protecting strategic industries where it needs to. And just to finish up, if I may, Ashray, the statistic that I think in some ways really illustrates some of these challenges from a European perspective, and a lot of people may not be aware of this, is that the vast majority of major European flag carriers, so British Airways, Lufthansa, SAS, LOT Airlines in Poland, no longer fly to China. And partly that's because they have been denied overflight rights over Russia, so they're not cost competitive with the Chinese airlines. But they are also saying that this is because of a slump in business demand from business travelers, which has never recovered since COVID, and which I think might be, if you were reading the tea leaves, you might read as an early indicator of some of these changes that we've been talking about in global supply chains.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's with that, let's just dive a little bit deeper into strategies on how we can build resilience. Before we go into that, Andrew, can you talk a little bit about what role supply chain visibility plays in building resilience, and then how can organizations better achieve transparency across tiers of their supply chains?
So, I mean, the short answer to this is that visibility of your supplier and your supplier's suppliers up through the supply chain is now becoming an essential feature of a well-managed supply chain, particularly when we talk about things like manufacturing, where you have components coming in from around the world. In terms of how we do that, I'm kind of old school in a way. I always advocate to clients, let's start by speaking to our suppliers, looking at things like SRM, so strategic supplier relationship management, which you should be doing anyway, but often gets forgotten about in the rush to sign deals with suppliers, get the savings, and then move on. I think that SRM piece becomes increasingly important as you want to build closer relationships with your suppliers to better understand the challenges that they're experiencing. And when they experience a challenge, to be sure that you're at the front of the queue to receive products that are on allocation. I think the other thing that is often forgotten about is the use of contracts to do this. So building clauses into your contracts when you sign your contract with suppliers that give you the right to audit your suppliers, and that in turn require them to have similar clauses and contracts that they have with their suppliers. Again, with the aim of building visibility up through the supply chain so you understand where the bottlenecks are. There are also then all the obvious technology solutions. Most people on this call, I'm sure, will be aware of so-called web scrapers that will scrape the web to try and build a picture of your supply chains. We do this for clients quite a lot. I think those kinds of tools will become more powerful over time. But as I say, I'm a little bit old school in this. I think this starts with doing the things that a well-run supply chain should be doing anyway, and that is speaking to your suppliers and building those closer relationships, sharing demand with them, to in turn get feedback from them about the challenges they're seeing and the issues they're experiencing to allow you to plan better.
Pick up your phone is the answer.
Pick up your phone is the answer. Absolutely.
First step is pick up the phone. Thank you, Andrew. Isabel, so how, from your perspective, how can companies manage the trade-off between the cost efficiency and resilience in today's environment? So how does that trade-off happen? Because it's you can have one or the other, right? That's going to be the perennial battle. You can either have a really cost-efficient, thin supply chain, or you build resilience and you invariably build fat. How do you balance the trade-off?
So, not always is mutually exclusive, right? I mean, and I think that's the $1 million question into, especially when you're looking at companies that are publicly traded and they have to show results, or inventory levels is into, as Andrew was saying, just in time to just in case. Obviously, COVID, I think, taught everybody one or two lessons about managing inventory, and who were the winners and who were the losers in that space as well. I think you need to keep both in mind as well when you're looking at this, right? Obviously, going back to Andrew's points, and very old school as well in terms of cost management, cost efficiency is always something that supply chain have been known for, right? Supply chain in traditional terms in any company is the afterthought of we sell our products, we build other products, and we have amazing products. Oh, and by the way, now we have to ship them somewhere. So let's try to minimize and get as efficient as we can in our logistic costs, right? So I think that mentality of always looking at costs, any professional will be telling you the first thing is into how can I become more efficient? How can I become leaner? How can I become more cost competitive, right? So obviously not only from the operational point of view, but also look at obviously, your procurement spend as well. I mean, some of the things that Andrew was mentioning about relationship with your suppliers, look at your contract term and conditions. That's the same thing that we recommend to our clients, and we do working with our clients as well in terms of what are the costs of those contracts and what is the cost of those supplier relationship. And obviously, one of the things that clearly is by negotiating those contracts, you become cost efficient, but also as well, you're signing long-term contracts where applicable. Also, that gives that the stability, visibility to your supplier as well, which again, you can become more cost competitive and they can become more competitive, depending obviously as well in terms of the supply chain where you are. You can be talking about risk sharing or profit sharing as well, in which is mutually beneficial to be efficient and also to give that flexibility in terms of working together to manage risks. And obviously the lesser the risk or the more centered thing that you have in that, the lesser the cost. So that for me is when they go more hand in hand, that is the trade-off into one with the others as well, right? Obviously, diversify suppliers, but also diversify markets, right? Geographical diversification. Who are your suppliers in your supply chain? And when you go to your tier 1, 2, and 3, is make sure that we are not concentrated, they are not concentrated in the same region, right? That's another one of the learnings with the pandemic, that when you look at, okay, my tier 1 suppliers in China, but my tier 2 and my tier 3 and my tier 4, they're all in China, right? And sometimes in the same region. So then you lose all your supply chain almost essentially overnight, right? And technology. Yes, I mean, automation, more and more automating inventory management, real time, shipments, understanding where they are, warehousing management system, all that allows you to want to be more aware of what your data is telling you, aware of some of the disruption, more flexible and in terms of reacting to any disruption, but also it makes you as well more efficient in terms of cost management as well.
Makes sense.
So those will be the ones I would suggest. Yeah.
Super. Thanks for those. Great tips. Matt, from your perspective, so the popular terms right now, or popular responses right now to geopolitical risks are reshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring. In your view, how effective are these strategies for building long-term resilience?
They're very, very, very effective, right? But they're not the whole story, and they're not necessarily things that are easy to implement, right? So, very, very easy to say, right? Let's reshore, right? Let's friendshore, but that can be a massive journey, right? For some industries, it could take you 10 years if you're going to try to move a silicon, foundry, right, to the U.S. or to nearshore, right? So these are things that are not to be taken lightly. They can create structural advantages, but I think it's really, really important to think about why you're doing it, right? From what seems obvious, right? But from the perspective of it can't be a short-term knee-jerk reaction, right? There are pressures on the business today that are going to say, I need to move to locations that are cost advantaged from a tariff perspective or from a global trade perspective. But I've got to be looking 10 to 15 years down the road, right? And saying, what is a supply chain design that's going to really have competitive advantages built into it for the long haul? Tariffs, trade incentives, economic policy. Well, that's what we're talking about today, right? These things change, right? And they come in and out of vogue. Our businesses and our supply chains are going to be there to stay. So we've really got to think about it from that perspective. I think the other element of it is preparation for those things, right? Creating optionality around what I can move. So if I can't move my facilities or my trade partners, right? Well, there's other things I can do. I can begin to create dual sources, right? I can begin to create more portability of my products, even within my own factory facilities, the ability to manufacture in one region versus another region, as opposed to some traditional approaches around manufacturing centers of excellence that we took, right? So we want to have both of those things, right? We want to have the efficiencies associated with it, but when times change, right, we also want to have portability of things that we can move, and we want to get control of our IP, right? I think some of that got lost in some of the transactions that occurred over the last 10 years as we tried to take advantage and capitalize on the assets, the intellectual property of our suppliers, right? They were doing design to spec for us, right, in certain areas. Well, that's great, right? It reduces the cost of developing a product, perhaps. The downside of it is we don't necessarily own that IP, and now it's a little harder, right, to move that. So thinking carefully about the optionality that we've got, not just in terms of reshoring, nearshoring of picking up a plant and moving it to someplace closer to home, right? We can think about that in terms of our data. Have we turned over our transportation and customer data to our 3PL and 4PL partners? Is that appropriate? Does that give us the optionality that we want, the insight that we want to be able to make the decisions? A lot of companies are looking very carefully at those things as well. So fundamentally, absolutely, friendshoring, nearshoring, whatever you want to call it, it comes down to designing networks that are advantaged, right, within the context that we're operating in today, but also what we see coming down in the future. And I like to talk about rehearsing, right? Rehearsing for the future. This is one of the things that we learned during COVID. Companies that really had rehearsed practices for business continuity and for disruptions, maybe not ever intended for an environment like COVID, but companies that had playbooks, right, around what if we can't open our data center today? What if customer service systems are all down, right, for the next month? What if a particular factory, right, is not able to get materials? What do we do? Who do we call? How do we drive things forward, right? So I think companies that rehearse those things, and rehearse them both strategically as well as operationally, put themselves in a really good position around this whole network resilience and building that resilient DNA into that restructured supply chain. Restructuring it itself doesn't solve all of the issues, right? It only solves some of them. It's really embedding that with the process-oriented things associated with a resilient enterprise, right? And resilient thinking in terms of how we plan and operate our supply chains every day.
Interesting. So it's essentially around you need to customize the strategy, which makes sense for you, right? Because there's multiple different options you need to pick off, and the answer is going to be all of them, or some of them, or part of some of them. Brilliant. We're going to launch a poll at this time. So I'll request Abby if you can just launch the poll just to get your view here on what strategies you feel your organizations urgently need and why are you not able to implement those. While you guys poll on those, we'll move on to adding more of a regional flavor on the resilient strategies. Maybe Andrew, let's go to you here to start off with at the top. So what do you think from a European perspective organizations are doing differently or need to do differently to manage the uncertainty today in the supply chains, given all of the challenges we just talked about, right? So what is it that they should be doing or are doing currently already?
Thanks, Ashray. So I think from a European perspective, the first thing is that there probably isn't a single view of what Europe should be doing or what European businesses should be doing in response to some of these big geopolitical issues. The strategic outlook and the challenges you face if you're a country bordering Ukraine, for example, are quite different from those that you face if you are a country bordering the Atlantic. But having said that, I think that there's a couple of things. The first is we advocate for and are already starting to see amongst our clients a move away from a one-size-fits-all supply chain model. So if you think about the story of supply chain over the last 20 to 25 years, in some respects, it's been an easy job. In some respects, I don't want to cause offense to anyone, but the easy play here has been to outsource manufacturing to low-cost countries, particularly places in Asia, obviously, and then manage the inbound freight. And that's kind of the job in a sense. Get your contracts in place with your ocean freight providers, find an outsourced manufacturer, and off you go. I think that world is clearly coming to an end, which is not to say that those kinds of supply chains are ending, but I think where we're going is a much more profound and deep understanding of the product portfolio, and then designing supply chains that are varied based on the characteristics of different products in the product portfolio. And it may well be that your low margin, high value products will continue to source components from low cost countries. But the more high value, more strategic products in your portfolio, you might be looking to onshore and nearshore production of components, or even vertically integrated, if that's the right thing to do, kind of to Matt's point earlier. So I think that's maybe the first big thing, is that we would advocate for, and as I say, are seeing evidence that the businesses are starting to do more of this. Part of that then requires supply chains to work much more closely with product design teams. So in the past, we used to talk a lot about design for cost, and the holy grail was to get supply chain and procurement involved early on to help the product design teams design products that were inherently low cost. I think the world we're moving to is working with product design teams to design products that are inherently more resilient, because you're sourcing components from countries that are, in some sense, safe to do business with, or that don't require you to establish these big global supply chains. And I expect we will see more of that, not just in Europe, obviously, but globally.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go
I
ahead.
think to me that those are probably the two big things. If I may, just very quickly as well,
Sure.
the other thing I did want to say is that I think that Europe faces a challenge, given that it's central to a lot of the big global supply chains. It trades extensively with North America, trades extensively with China. And to my earlier point, I think the challenge that European business faces is, how do you protect your strategic suppliers at a time when you probably also want to continue trading with a lot of your in situ markets? The German automotive industry is a good example of this. Huge factories in China, huge demand in China, and a real reluctance to take steps that might damage that business. But at the same time, needing to recognize that the threat from Chinese EVs represents a profound long-term threat to the European automotive industry. So that's the challenge for European businesses, is how do you walk that line? And that, I think, if I was being commercial for a second, might drive a lot of work that I do over the next 5 years with my clients.
Thanks, Andrew. Isabel, let's go to you. So from the region, considering the scale of some of the massive projects in the region, right? They're truly giga projects. How are MENA-based organizations building resilience in response to the regional as well as the global geopolitical challenges?
So some of the companies, obviously, some of the clients that we have is obviously aligning with the strategies, the national strategies, and diversifying the economy. Because also, as I say, they are providing incentives, but also as well in terms of one of the key components, obviously, of the localization strategy is localizing supply chains. So is for them, they see the benefit of aligning to that strategy, because they will have access to an internal market that at the moment was somewhat limited. And also there is a lot of small and medium enterprises as well. So one of the things is localizing manufacturing as well. So there is a lot of movement in terms of companies acquiring foreign investors, merging with local companies. So it's to have an immediate access to the market. Also, as well, in terms of investing in modernizing manufacturing capabilities, increasing manufacturing capabilities as well. There is a big push in terms of creating for the key sectors that they have defined in the economies, creating the manufacturing capabilities in the kingdom as well. So, if you have access to that, if you sign MOUs with some of those companies, you have access to your local supply, and you are ahead of the queue, so to speak, as well. Also, for instance, as well, when you're talking about some of the giga projects, for instance, now it has been announced recently that there is already a manufacturing plant that is producing concrete in Neom. as well. So this is something that you're already having access to one of your key raw materials in there as well. And also some of those as well, as we were producing before, instead of getting early as a supply chain and as a procurement organization, getting early and the design stages of those construction gear projects. And some of the, the new developing companies that they are being set up, obviously by PIF, because then you can start shaping the supply chain that you need. And also you start putting the requirements that you have at the moment that some years down the line, you are going to be reaping the benefits of that early involvement, that early defining of those requirements as well, in terms of what are the specifications that are wanting, the thickness of the glass, or the length of the panel, because that is going to determine how easy access you're going to have to that supply chain later in the future.
Interesting. Thanks, Isabel. Matt, just lastly to you, and I'm just conscious of time, so maybe I don't want to leave some time at the end for questions, but I do want to get your view in here as well. From a US perspective, how are the companies adjusting their supply chains designs to cope with the uncertainty? Particularly considering the government incentives that we we're just talking about, right, with regards to reshoring and increased tariffs potentially as well. So how are the companies adjusting their supply chain designs?
Well, first thing, they are adjusting their supply chain designs, and those discussions are happening at the boardroom level. They have been for some period of time. I would say they're accelerating, at this juncture, right? So there is an adjustment that's going on, and an adjustment that's going on, in terms of how do I structure things, geopolitically, in terms of access. It also is playing into investment decisions. We saw, I would say, over the last 5 years, some very dramatic investment in technology, what many companies were calling the digital core, the ability to digitize everything, right? The ubiquitous dream of all of us in supply chain, right? To know everything about everything all the time, instantly, right? Everywhere. Wow, yeah, really cool. But hey, it's going to take a long time to try to get there. And so companies spent some $10 billion plus over the last 5 years focusing in on looking at how technologies were going to solve this problem for them. And I like what Andrew said about this, that so human intelligence has a lot to add here, right? And talking is a super powerful thing. So companies are mobilizing, right? They're mobilizing, we'll call it war rooms or risk teams, both within their enterprises and with their extended networks, right? And their core trade partners, to understand what there's more points of view, right, around what's happening, what might happening, and also what are others doing, right? It's not a singular game, right? You're playing on a board with a lot of players, and they're all moving their pieces at the same time. So those kinds of things are being mobilized, right now. So there's activity at the strategic planning level. There's activity at the structural level. There's activity at the driving connectivity within our supply chain community, at multiple tier levels. Some of it rudimentary, conversation based, right? But formalized, right? And making sure that those messages are getting to senior management and leadership. Look, in supply chain, we have always been in the business of making bets. That's what we do. That is what supply chain is. There is never any certainty. It is always a probabilistic curve, right? Of a product being availability, manufacturing completing, having a yield date, meeting a date, being distributed and on the shelf, whatever the case may be. It's all about probabilities. We've always been in that business. That has never been more important than right now. And the discussion across the organization around what assumptions are we making is absolutely crucial. And the best companies are taking that on. They're saying, look, we have within our supply chain made these assumptions about what the scenarios are that we're facing, and what our tolerance for risk is within that. Are we all on the same page? Frankly, most companies aren't. Not all of them have even documented it or thought it through. And it is absolutely crucial to get that sorted and get that sorted right now. Job one.
Brilliant. Thank you. With that, we're going to bring the discussion to a close, but now we're going to start taking, we're going to answer some of the questions submitted during today's discussion. There's been quite a few questions that have come in, but I think just conscious of time, let's pick a couple that we can talk through for very briefly. So first off, someone's asked, what are the emerging trends or innovations that could redefine supply chain resilience in the next 5 to 10 years? Who wants to take that up? If not, I can just choose someone. Maybe Andrew, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. And I'll combine it with answer to another question that we had in the question section, which is around potential cyber risk. So to me, one of the big emerging trends and risks that I still don't think that we pay enough attention to is the potential for nation state actors to take out entire regions via coordinated cyber attacks. And just to provide a little bit of color to that, during the COVID pandemic, I was privileged enough to lead the supply chain assurance function within the British government's vaccine task force. And a huge amount of what that role entailed was thinking about the potential for cyber attacks on the suppliers of vaccines to the British government. Now, that's not just people like Pfizer and AstraZeneca, but also, perhaps more importantly, their suppliers. So the component suppliers that they're buying single-use consumables from, bioreactor bags, tubing, that kind of thing. I think that is one of the was and will continue to be one of the big emerging stories over the next 5 to 10 years, is the ability for, call them rogue actors, to attack the big Western economies by going after big players by the use of cyber attacks. And I still don't think it's a risk that's properly understood and properly protected for. So I think what I'm saying is keep an eye on that story, because that story is going to play big over the next 5 years.
Interesting. Let's take one more question. How do you see make buy decisions model adapting? And are we seeing increase in sourcing as well as onshoring? Maybe Matt, I think you partly answered that question previously. Do you want to take that one on how make buy decision models might adapt moving forward?
Yeah, it's again about the shift of how you think about it, right? Why are you looking at make versus buy, right? We've traditionally looked at it from a total cost of ownership perspective. Now we have this additional overlay which can't be denied. We have to look at it from the perspective of risk and potential outcomes, into the future. So, leaving or shifting a product to a company because it's perhaps not a core operation for us, but is crucial to our ability to adapt and to adjust to risk, makes it more of a candidate to insource. And we are seeing more of it. I think we will continue to see more of it. And it's really fundamentally the shift in the math, right? That's what we do in supply chain. We do math, right? We do a lot of math, right? And we look at a lot of different scenarios, and we look at a lot of different models, and those models are becoming more complicated now. We have to update them, right? But when we apply them in the case of make versus buy and do dual sourcing, that math will tell you that it increasingly makes sense to have more than one source and to be insourcing things. But obviously, it's going to vary very greatly, right, by sector and by commodity and particular kinds of materials. But this also speaks to the need to keep that optionality, right? Keep those options open, own your intellectual property, so you have the ability to move things in or out, or to other regions or to other suppliers across that platform. So bottom line, yes, see more.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, just conscious of time, unfortunately, we won't be able to take the rest of the questions. We have made the poll results visible to all, so you'll see it's an interesting dynamic of it. It speaks a lot about human capital. I see there's a big element of trading and upskilling for risk-focused procurement as a big strategy, along with what's stopping it is the lack of expertise. So I see a interesting dynamic there, definitely from a soft perspective in the responses that you guys have given. Just to close this off, I'm going to go quickly, Matt, Andrew, Isabel, very quickly, 5 seconds. If there was one piece of advice you'd give this group of supply chain procurement leaders today, navigating today's volatile environment, what would that piece of advice be? Quick 10 seconds. Maybe, Matt, you're first on my screen, so I'm going to pick on you to go first.
Know where you are, know what the scenarios are, and rehearse.
Brilliant. Andrew, you want to go next?
I guess to my earlier point, make sure that you are on all of your key suppliers' Christmas card list. You want to be in first name basis with your key suppliers.
Nice. Good one. Isabel?
Well, I'm gonna be summarizing both Matt and Andrew, technology, invest and use technology for better decision making, and definitely build a strong relationship with their strategic suppliers.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you all. That's all the time we have for today. So thank you, Andrew, Matthew, Isabel, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll be directed to a survey. We would really appreciate it if you give us some feedback that helps us make the future sessions even better. You will receive a follow-up with email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to today's recording as well. Unless I look horrible in them, then we probably need a little bit more time to AI upscale and might add a little bit of few hours, but you'll get that regardless. Again, thank you all for joining and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.